Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get going. It's just about 2:03. We've still got some people coming in, so we'll probably hear some beeps along the way. But I do want to get started, so we pretty much start and finish close to on time. Um, I appreciate everyone joining us today. I've noticed a lot of the names coming in and registering, they're the same folks, so I feel like we're gathering a pretty nice following for these fast-packed webinars. I see a lot of consistent names month after month, which is great. So I really appreciate that. Let me just set mute here. There we go. So I appreciate that. I can't believe I'm just looking at the date here on the slide. I can't believe it's the end of August. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I feel like I blinked at the beginning of June, and here we are at the end of August. But I guess that means life is good and life is busy. So we'll get started today. We're going to do a webinar on one of the series we're doing on this executive dashboard. As many of you know, the executive dashboard is a concept we came out with several months ago. We think it's a pivotal new way to look at a club in its entirety, but not deep diving into a package of financials that you might traditionally see at a board meeting that's an inch thick that obviously nobody can really digest. So the whole notion of this dashboard, we'll talk a little bit more about it before we deep dive into these couple KPIs. But it is about, just like a business, any business, doesn't look at 50 pages of financials to understand its health. It looks at the 12, 14, 15 indicators that are representative of its health. And if you understand the relationship of those indicators to the health of the club, that's really the goal, because you can't manage 500 tactical line items, but you can manage 15, which as you move those 15 one way or the other, by definition impact all the tactical things below it. So that's really the way to do it. I mean, imagine if you were driving a car and instead of just having gas pedal, brake pedal, steering wheel, you literally had all levers and dials that were going to all the different components in the car that needed input. Well, it's kind of the same thing here, right? This is really ironically, we are calling it the dashboard, and it is kind of the dashboard for driving a club, if you will. That's a little clumsy analogy that I just thought of, but there it is. So we'll get started. As most of you know, we do record these, and so they're great if you like them to forward on to board members, staff members, controllers, whoever else in the club might not be on it that you think might benefit. And we do have a pretty nice library now of these webinars that are on this page over on the public side of the website. I mean, that's the beautiful thing. You don't need to be a club benchmarking subscriber to see these and to use the information. We'd obviously love you to, and we think you're better off for subscribing and using the information more effectively. But obviously, there's great value whether you subscribe or not. So there's one on the overall dashboard we've done. There was one on the capital KPIs we did last month. So if you haven't looked at those two, you may want to go over to that page and take a look at those. They're pretty good. And there's a number of other ones that we've done as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There is a chat box on your screens, and so if you do have questions along the way, feel free to type them in that chat box. I probably won't be able to look at them in real time, but what we'll do at the end is we'll take a look at them, see what questions we have, and Terry Finan from our team is also on the line, and she'll help me call through those as they come in. So feel free to do that, and questions are great. I mean, I love doing these, and it's to me personally, the more questions I get, the more interesting they are. So keep them coming if you have them. I'm just going to take a second here. The folks that have been on these know that I always do a little bit of a preface about the industry, because I think it sets the stage of why the industry needs standardized information. It's always shared information in a very ad hoc manner, but it really hasn't been in a standardized manner, frankly, until we've been around. And I think it hasn't been in a way that's more of a business-oriented view of a club, as opposed to setting lots of rationalizations, often incorrect, or perceptions because, we're clubs, we're different. Well, you're not really that different. You may not be trying to generate a profit at the end of the day, but you're still, multi-million-dollar businesses. It's a big industry. If we look at the CMA clubs, it's about a $20 billion industry, with the largest club being just under $100 million. So that means it's a very fractured industry. There's 3,000 clubs in that set. And so, it's unlike other industries, which are very top down. This is very, very flat. and there are lots and lots of players. And I think that's one of the reasons maybe standardization hasn't been driven in, is because there haven't been those, in a normal industry, you'd have some, multi-billion-dollar companies which are driving standardization. And this has got all these individual little players, which frankly don't have the wherewithal or the resources to, to try to drive standardization to the industry. But that's what we've been doing. And we think with great effect on individual clubs and on the industry. Clubs have a challenging governance model. As we know, in those 3,000 clubs, there's about 33,000 governors walking around the country right now, with their hat on saying, hey, I'm a board member at a club, with obviously very little training for that other than being a member in that club. They don't understand the machinations or the financial indicators of the club industry like they do their own industries. And so that's a big challenge, and often results in ineffective governance. We often say that unfortunately the median part of the industry is probably where boards are a hindrance to the success of the club, and there's a lot of work to be done just to get them to neutral. And certainly you've got some boards that are very, very good and are in fact a positive influence on the club. Our goal is to ultimately move up the curve on that. So as I said, there's been no standardized measures for clubs, and that's what this is all about, right? Standardization has a significant impact on performance measurement and on performance and on governance, because if every club is looking at the same type of things, the whole industry gets smarter together at the same time, and you understand what should my gross margin be and how to measure it, and what should my ratios be that we're going to look at today and how to measure them, etc. So standardization is a big step towards both simplifying and improving the way you measure and manage an individual club. So we're going to look today on the executive dashboard. There's two operational KPIs, which is interesting. There's only two, but they're two that have lots of tentacles inside the organization. One is what we call the payroll ratio, and the other is what we call the net food and beverage ratio. And we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on each one of those. I've certainly talked about those in other webinars, and some of you will find this information a little redundant, but there's nothing wrong with hearing, the same information if it's important more than once. We all know that studies have said that we capture about 10% we actually learn and capture about 10% of what we hear. So I know personally I need to hear things a few times to learn them. So we'll explain why they matter. And the key part is that these are really plannable and controllable ratios that have impact on the club. If we were looking at ratios that you weren't able to manipulate or didn't have a bottom line impact on the club, that would be kind of a waste of time, right? It'd be like having a steering wheel that wasn't connected to the front tires. Total waste of time. You could change them all you want. You're not going to change your direction at all. And so these do have a lot of impact. Obviously, one is more correlated to food and beverage, and the other, touches really every aspect of the club, as we'll see when we talk about labor. And, the goal of all this is to be proactive, not reactive. We're going to touch on that theme as we go through it. And in that proactivity, actually create predictability on the performance of the club, not, less on the reactive side. So this whole notion of the common industry dashboard, and lots of industries have these, and I've done talks specifically on this, and the first part of the series goes into a little more about this. But you think about industries have standard measures, whether you're a software industry or a construction industry, an automotive industry. Everyone has the metrics they measure to assess their health, and they don't differ widely from company to company within that industry. This industry hasn't had that. It's had political footballs like cost of food that have gotten kicked around, but not truly business impacting measures. So, we always ask the question, what if every club measured the same key metrics? How would that change when a group of controllers or a group of GMs or two board members got together and were talking about clubs? Or you had some of these, manager and governor type of meetings at the CMA chapters, How would that change the discussion if everybody was speaking from a common language? It would completely change it, as opposed to the crazy discussions of, well, we put our F&B guy in G&A, so our F&B results look better. We put him over here. All that stuff is nonsense. So standardization is the key. And right now that's basically what we are, is a standardization engine for the industry. And the clubs that subscribe get the benefit of that standardization, because when they're looking at a measure, they're looking at it in the same way that we've got 1,000+ other clubs looking at the same measure, and that's a big benefit. But the goal is, by these standard measures, you overcome the cult of personality. You ultimately, as I discussed, improve club governance, and it's the clubs that are challenged that really need that information, because once clubs get under stress, that's when the craziness really starts to come out, and especially if you've got some aggressive board members who are determined that they know what's wrong and they know how to fix it. I don't mean to dump on board members, but it's just the reality of the industry. If you don't have those standard measures, it's very hard to counter that stuff when the club is under stress. Ultimately, all this is about, I love the Gartner term here. It's about creating measures that are predictive of performance, and we think that's what we've done with a pretty good effect. So what we're going to look at today is the operations section of the executive dashboard. As you can see, there's a little clumsy, but we call one operating finance. That's where your G&A is, and your revenue and your net operating result. There's about 5 measures there. There's about 3 measures under capital generation. And then under the operations, we really just look at 2. The first one we're going to look at is this payroll ratio. And for every one of these KPIs in the dashboard, for a KPI to be relevant, it has to answer a specific and important question. And the question that this particular KPI answers is, are we staffed at a level that balances financial results and member service? That's what the level of labor, the amount of labor that you have in the club is really all about balancing. How much can we afford, and what do members expect of us, and in terms of service. There's an efficiency piece in there we'll talk about as well, but that's really the question that we answer. And so, when you talk about the perception versus reality, we all hear this stuff, right? Relative to labor, these off-the-cuff comments that are thrown around in clubs. Our labor's too high. I look around and I see people standing around. I went down to the pro shop and there were 3 guys standing there. All that kind of craziness that really doesn't have any measurement behind it. Or the flip side, right? I'm sitting at the table, I can't get a drink. It's taken me 10 minutes to get a drink. We need more people. And all those are statements that are begging to have a measurement thrown against them, so that either you can back up the statement, maybe it's in fact true, or you can counter the statement and say, well, it's actually not true. Let's talk about why you're unhappy, but it's not about the level of labor that we have. Of course, the dreaded, at my other club, we do it this way, right? And that's one of the banes that you have in a lot of higher end clubs where you've got members that are members at multiple clubs. But ultimately, every club needs to understand its own sustainable level of labor, and we're going to look at that as a ratio. Obviously, that ultimately correlates to a dollar amount, but it really is, the way to measure it is not as a dollar amount, because that's all over the place with clubs. But you want to look at it as a particular ratio, and that's what we're going to look at. Now, just a little definitional stuff. So the payroll ratio, it's really simple. It's about as simple as you can get. It's the total loaded payroll, loaded meaning it's all the benefits, health care, pension benefits, all the stuff, everything, all the payroll taxes, benefits, and salary and wages thrown in one big bucket. That's your total loaded payroll, simply divided by the operating revenue of the club. Lots of industries use these measures, and it certainly applies and is very consistent actually in this industry. It's important because payroll is the largest expense in the club. We'll see that as a percentage in a minute. And it's also important, I mentioned those tentacles earlier, but the payroll ratio directly correlates to the net operating result of the club. It's a lever that when you move it one way or the other is going to have a direct bottom line impact. Now, you can say that about any expense in the club. Obviously, dollar for dollar, there's a bottom line impact on the club. But this one is such a big expense for the club that it really is an important one to understand, right? It's not so important to know what's my cost of fertilizer relative to the operating revenue of the club, right? That doesn't have the impact that something like the overall labor ratio does. And as I mentioned, it does represent this critical intersection of member service, operational efficiency, and financial results. That's really what you're trying to manage or trying to gauge when you talk about this payroll ratio. And so that, we'll move on to some data. But for the folks that are members, and I think there's a lot of them, club benchmarking members on the page, when you run there's 2 versions of the executive dashboard report. One's the Word version, one's the PowerPoint version with charts. When you run the Word version, I just wanted to point out where that particular section that we're looking at now is. These are obviously all important, and you need to look at it in a encompassed, total dashboard, if you will. But that's where these are that we're talking about. And just, specifically, you can start to almost imagine, forget about looking at the graphs, but when you have those statements like too high, too low, what are all these people doing? And you can put a measure behind it that says, well, our payroll ratio is 56%. When I look at clubs of our size, the median is 57%, the 25th percentile is 52%, and the 60th percentile is 60%. So we're right down, what this means is that for every dollar of revenue, operating revenue that comes in, 56 cents goes to labor. That's why I say it's the biggest expense of the club, because 56 cents of every dollar goes to labor. But you can imagine, even just throwing something simple like that on the table, how it can impact the discussion. Okay, it's not too high. You may be unhappy with something else within the labor. Let's talk about that. But it's not too high. And in some cases, if you were low, you might want to say, we're low, we need to boost it a little bit more. So I just wanted to point that out for the folks that run those. Now, so when we look at the payroll ratio, this is it as a curve. We can see there is variation in the industry, certainly. I mean, we see it runs, the tails of the industry, you tend not to focus on too much, because those are anomalies, right? It's really the beef, the middle of the industry, that is the most telling for where clubs should be looking relative to where they are. But you see, I mean, it does run from 50% up to 60%. Now that's pretty tight. That actually tells you, while there is variation, and that variation has a big impact, it tells you that the club industry model has to run in a labor ratio that's pretty darn tight. You're talking about plus or minus 5 points off the median is where the things start to probably break down, either because you have way too much labor or because you don't have enough labor. So it's important to know where you are. As I said, there is a very high correlation to the net operating result of the club based on this ratio. The median of the industry is 55%. By the way, we've been doing this about 5 years. It's been pretty consistent. As clubs have gotten healthier, it has moved up a couple points. 3 years ago, that was about 53%. Now we see it dance, depending on where we look, 54, 55%. So it has gone up a little, but not a lot. And so what we see is, the clubs that are down around this 50-52 range, those are the clubs that either run really, really lean. They tend to be small clubs, probably struggling areas. We've run into some of these, and they run thin, thin, thin. And frankly, when you look at that three-legged stool of member service, operational efficiency, and financial expectation or financial results, the one they focus less on, frankly, is member service, because at a 50% labor ratio, you're kind of throwing member service to the side a little bit and saying, hey, we're going to be really lean, and we're going to try to meet our numbers because we're in a little bit of trouble. Now, that's what those clubs tend to look like, or the clubs that are for-profit clubs tend to run very lean as well. They run fewer hours in food and beverage. They just tighten up the whole labor pool by and large. The clubs on the top end of the scale, I've always said, once you get above 60%, it's very challenging to make money or to break even operationally. And as we see, these little blurbs here, on the left half of the median, only 25% of clubs have a deficit, meaning they didn't support themselves operationally. 75% of them break even or have a surplus, and you can see they throw off a decent surplus at the median. Clubs on this side of the middle, 60% of them have a deficit, and 40% of them break even or have a surplus, and the median is right around break even for the clubs on this half of the curve. And obviously, as you get into these quartiles, the clubs that are in this upper quartile, frankly, almost none of them, very few of them actually hit break even. Most of them burn cash, and clubs down here, they often throw off cash, but again, you have to be careful about the reasons. And you can see the operating bottom line for the middle, for the left lower quartile and the upper quartile. These clubs tend to burn money. These clubs tend to throw off cash, unless you're here because you're really unhealthy and you're down to the bare bones. That's a little bit of a different story. One of the interesting things we look at is we say, well, if certainly the really great clubs must spend more on labor than we do. And this is where that spend word can be a funny word. Spend can mean dollar amount, and spend can mean a percentage, right? A ratio, a benchmark. And interestingly, when you look at the group of clubs, we have many of them in the database, the distinguished and platinum clubs, what you find is the labor ratio isn't that different. I mean, the median is 57%. It's a couple points higher. 25th percentile basically the same, and 75th percentile basically the same. They're a point off. So they're within a point or two in every one of these quadrants. So they're not spending more of their money on labor as a percentage. Now, it probably is a bigger number because they tend to have more, more money. They tend to be a little bit bigger clubs, although certainly not all of them. And the other thing that's interesting is there's probably a perception that says, oh yeah, well that's, when you spend $15,000 a year on dues, that's what you get. You get distinguished level service. Well, you know what? The median dues for a full member at these clubs is $7,200, which is just a little bit higher over the median for the entire industry. So it's not that you need to be, you have to. These numbers are drastically different depending on if you're a distinguished club, a more pedestrian club. It's pretty consistent across the industry in terms of trying to manage to that ratio. I always find that part pretty interesting. So, clearly knowing where you are and where you are relative to norms, because one of the things about, what we do in a standardized manner is when we map a member's data right from your trial balance file, we do it exactly the same way for every club. So the benchmarks are all measured exactly the same way. But regardless of how you do it, understanding where you are and understanding where that is relative to the norms is a critical part of the process. And if you start to use that as intelligence. If our labor ratio looks high and we're burning cash operationally, well, that's one of the levers you should probably look to move down the curve, and you're going to see obviously a dollar for dollar impact. Now, it's not always easy to know where to pull that labor out, but that is the process by which any business says my result is X and I want it to be different than X. And some of my indicators are here, and I know if I move that indicator one way or the other, it's gonna move the operational result the way I want it to. That's the way all business runs, and frankly, clubs are no different. And so also, use this ratio in your budgeting process. So when you set your budget, which many clubs are starting to get into, certainly if you're a benchmarking subscriber, we can help you do that and basically do a dashboard, a budget dashboard for you. You can know going into next year, if I hit my numbers, what is my dashboard going to look like for all my KPIs? That's a big deal, right? Put that in front of a board and have that level of discussion rather than horse trading, dollars back and forth here and there. So, use it in your budgeting process is my final part of the advice. But ultimately, think about it is this three-legged stool of service, efficiency, and financial results. That's the balance point. But there is a very consistent number in the industry, and knowing where you are is the first step. If we look at the next one we're going to take a look at, and I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because, as always, I tend to run a little behind. So we'll probably go a little bit over the 2:30 mark, but just by a few minutes, I think. The what we call the net F&B ratio, and what question are we answering? It's an important question to think from a couple perspectives. What's the financial impact of F&B on the club? It's not, how do we run, are we running it like a restaurant, or what's the, looking at F&B as a department. It really is putting it in the context of the club. And what we do is we look at the net operating result of F&B, and we put it against the gross profit of the club. I'll take another look at that in a second. But, same kind of things here with perception, right? We hear these all the time still, regardless of how long we hammer on this. We should make money in F&B. We need more banquets. Labor's too high. Food cost is too high. The bottom line is boards spend too much time on the bowels of F&B financials. And this is a ratio that brings it up to a level that, frankly, unless there's really something wrong, a board shouldn't really be deep diving below this level very often at all. And so what we do is we take the net financial result in F&B, most cases it's a loss, and we divide it by the gross profit of the club. You've heard us also call that available cash. Available cash and gross profit are synonymous in our modeling. And when we do that, it puts it in overall context to the overall club. We're not saying, let's look at F&B as a restaurant. We're saying, what is the impact of our F&B department on the club, right? It's an amenity of the club, just like tennis is an amenity of the club. Golf is an amenity of the club. A pool is an amenity of the club. F&B is an amenity of the club. You want to be efficient, but it's an amenity. And this one, as we'll see, helps settle that debate. And it does simplify the in-year oversight and not having to dive in so much into this, hey, are we going to have any banquets next month? Or, all these kind of crazy tactical discussions. So, when we look at this one, obviously this tabular dashboard report members should run. And again, it's the same type of thing where if you know what the median of the peer set you're looking at is, and you know where you are in the 25th and 75th percentiles, you can start to both set expectations and set a baseline for, okay, this is how we've run. You can even go back a couple years and do it, right? This is how we've run. We've run with putting a subsidy into food and beverage that equates to 4% of the club's gross profit. 4%, right? It's not 90%, it's not 10%, it's 4%. It's generally a low number. Some clubs are higher, and we'll talk about that. But knowing where you are is critical. And in most cases, when you start to use this data in a couple charts, frankly, it puts the issue to bed. And we're very relieved when a lot of GMs tell us, yeah, we haven't talked about food and beverage in 6 months because we started using this perspective. It is a big part of the revenue of the club, right? It's almost a third of the revenue for most clubs. In half the industry, it runs between 25% of a club's revenue and 36% of a club's revenue. So it's a big chunk of revenue. And so there's a natural tendency to say, well, because it's such visible revenue, we should be spending a lot of time on it. And that's not really the right way to think about it, because it's revenue that basically flows in one door and flows out the other door, because it's being, literally consumed as you serve your members. And as we know, if we look at where gross profit in the club comes from, it really only comes from two, maybe three areas. Comes from dues, obviously. It comes from golf operations if you have golf. And maybe you get a little bit out of your sports and recreation, right? You might get some tennis guest fees and swimming and fitness and that kind of stuff. But at the industry level, there's actually no gross profit generated from food and beverage, right? So that's an important thing for boards to understand. And we're going to dive into the ratio specifically in a second. But a lot of clubs look at net food and beverage as a percentage of F&B revenue, right? How much did F&B gain or lose relative to the size of the F&B department? It's not bad. It's a good way to look at it. It's a rational ratio, and the industry runs around an 8% loss on F&B revenue. So if you had a $1 million F&B operation and you were right at the middle, you would have lost $80,000. And it still tells you, even our charts. This is one of our charts in the food and beverage report. It still shows you that 3/4 of the clubs lose money in food and beverage. And so that's a good message to get across to people that are, trying to oversee or govern the club. But it does only look at it from a departmental perspective, not the club perspective. And it doesn't yet answer the question of, well, Club A can lose $300,000 and it's devastating. Club B can lose $300,000 and it's meaningless. What makes it devastating or meaningless is how much of my gross profit did that $300,000 equate to? If it equated to 4% of my gross profit, I know I'm right smack down the middle of the industry. If it was 15% of the gross profit, that might be a problem. It might not be. You'd have to look at the operational result of the club. Some clubs run at those kind of food and beverage subsidies, but they have such a massive dues engine that they almost treat dues as like a pay one price, and then you kind of get everything, everything for it. And so they don't care about a big food and beverage subsidy because their dues engine is so strong. That's not the case in most clubs. Most clubs have to have a rational dues engine, about 50% of revenue, and have to have a rational subsidy, somewhere in this break even to 10%, 10% range. And obviously some clubs do throw off a little bit of cash. Actually, I just realized my break-even line's in the wrong place here. It should be slid down. Sorry about that. And if they do throw off, it's a little bit. You're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4% of their gross profit coming from food and beverage, and quite often they're turning the club into a banquet factory to get there, which can obviously be problematic. So when I say it puts it in context with the club, this is exactly what I mean, right? It's saying, what is the impact of that department on the resources of the club that we need to fund everything else, right? Gross profit is what you use to fund the fixed operations of the club, the chorus, G&A, the buildings, right? All that stuff that I've talked about in the past. And so in a way, the food and beverage subsidy is in fact competition for that, but it's rational at a reasonable level, like the industry is at somewhere in these negative single digits. This isn't what we think it is. We just spit back what the industry does, and we see that the industry runs healthy, running in these modes. or it's a rational place to be anyway. So, we use these charts to just hammer home that F&B is an amenity. It's not a profit center in the industry. In an individual club, clubs go one way or the other, and they really want it to be a profit center, often to the detriment of the club. The distinguished and platinum clubs, by the way, again, not markedly different, despite the fact that they would have a reputation that is, maybe superlative, I guess. You can see at the median, a distinguished and platinum club has a food and beverage loss that equates to 6% of their gross profit, a couple points more than the industry overall, and those couple points kind of generate across 13% up to 1% at the 75th percentile. But generally the same kind of ballpark. It's just that that's the amount of money that they in fact use to subsidize food and beverage, and it's a different discussion, right? You get out of this. How do we lose $300,000 on food and beverage? We're a $2 million operation. You can't have that dollar discussion. I can't emphasize this hard enough. You have to put the discussion into something that has meaning. And when you put it in terms of how much of our gross profit is, it turns $300,000, which sounds like a huge number to some people, into this very rational number of a few percentage points of our gross profit. And look, it's an amenity, and we fund it with dues like we do all the other amenities in the club, and it's a relatively, small amenity is the reality of it in terms of funding. If you look at how much of your gross profit goes to the course, it's a third, right? This is 10% of that. So it's the right way to look at it. And there are some interesting attributes when you look at clubs that fit in the different levels here. It tends to be that clubs that have a higher subsidy are a little bit larger clubs. They have a little more dues revenue. Their dues is higher because, as I mentioned, they have a stronger dues engine, and they simply view it as F&B as, that's one of the subsidies or one of the amenities we have to subsidize, and we have a good dues engine to do that. They tend to be the clubs that have a higher initiation fee, so they have this confidence in the value proposition, and the reality is they have a relatively lower proportion of their revenue coming from food and beverage. They're not out there chasing every banquet that they can, thinking they need to bolster up that food and beverage revenue. So I'm not saying what's right or wrong here. I'm just saying there are some attributes here that are interesting when you look on this end versus this end. The clubs that tend to get to break even, it's not surprising. We've seen this for several years. They tend to be the smaller clubs with a little bit lower dues. I don't like the word pedestrian, but a little more pedestrian clubs, a lower initiation fee, and they tend to, really, really push F&B as part of the equation for them. Now, and it's interesting, you can get a high F&B ratio for a couple different reasons, and it has different impacts on the club. If you have a high F&B ratio, and we've done studies that show high F&B usage relative to the net operating bottom line of the club. And what's interesting is when you look at the F&B ratio, F&B as a percentage of overall revenue of the club, it can happen because a lot of members are really actively using it, or it can happen because you're chasing out lots of banquets. And so in the case where you're chasing lots of banquets, what you're doing is you're putting that member satisfaction generally on the side. And what we find is that has a detrimental impact on the bottom line operating result of the club. If you have a high F&B ratio as a percentage of revenue because your members are really in there actively using the club, that tends to have a positive impact on the bottom line operating result of the club. So if you're one of those clubs that are up here in how much of your revenue comes from F&B, you might want to take a look and say, are we there because we're chasing banquets and quite often to the detriment of members, or are we there because our members love coming here and they won't go home and we're brooming them out the door every night? Important to try to understand that distinction when you're thinking about this particular ratio. All right, I'm going to start wrapping up here because we're getting a little bit late. So in closing on that ratio, clearly F&B is an ultra important amenity. There's no one in the industry disputes that. But that concept of run it like a restaurant, the board member who owns 20 Papagenos or owns a restaurant and says, why can't we have a 22% food cost or 24% labor cost? it's because it's not a restaurant. And the best way we have found to educate them is to just show them, here's how the rest of the industry operates, right? They operate as an amenity with these kind of ratios: 63% labor ratio, 42% food costs. Add those up, you get 105%. That's why we call it an amenity, not a profit center, right? That's an important expectation setting discussion to have. Now, if you want to drive it hard and try to, drive efficiency, drive efficiency, drive efficiency, you can do that. But when you really measure out the dollar impact on the club versus the strain it puts on the club, I haven't seen really any cases where that's the right thing to do, unless the club's in an unusual situation, which does happen sometimes. And so if you have deep dives financially into F&B in the boardroom, it's often a red flag that you should step back a little bit. If you're a club benchmarking member, if not, maybe it's a reason to a pain point you can tackle by joining. Step back a little bit and say, hey, let me educate them on the role of F&B in the industry and a couple of these indicators. I'd use the one we looked at here and maybe F&B labor ratio. A couple of these indicators to set these expectations. And now let's start measuring our club that way. So when we budget next year, we actually say, we're using the dashboard and we're saying, okay, well, this is going to be our revenue. This is going to be our dues revenue. Everything it blows out automatically. This will be our gross margin. And we think it's reasonable to do what the industry does. And we're going to set a 4% of gross profit subsidy into food and beverage. Now, managers, go manage, right? You don't have to every month go in and dive into food cost and variations and all those kind of things. Those are distractions from the things the board should really be talking about, which is, are we generating enough capital to reinvest in this club properly? Are we getting the membership we need? Do we have the membership level we need, and do we have the number of members we need, and is our dues right? All those kind of really strategic things. So to summarize this stuff too, and I apologize for going about 10 minutes over, the goal of all this is predictive performance and using these measures to tighten and focus the decisions and discussions, not have them vary and wander over everybody's opinion, but to focus them on the few measures that matter, not the many measures that don't matter, right? That's a big problem in the industry. And so, these KPIs, along with the other ones, really do help you predict performance, because if you go through your budget process and you say, if we hit our numbers, these are going to be our indicators, you kind of know where you're going to end up. Now, you're going to get some curveballs thrown at you during the year. There's no doubt about that. But you'll be a little smarter about, well, that curveball came in. That's going to impact this indicator. And what does that mean? And, obviously we help clubs do that. But so, use it in your budget process. And I kind of put the rhetorical question. If you use these kind of KPIs or the executive dashboard in your budget process, do you think you'll be more likely or less likely to hit your numbers? And you think, the budget process will be maybe, more sane or less sane? And I guess it's rhetorical, but I think, we've seen which way it tends to go. If you're a member, make sure you go in and run your executive dashboard reports. There's a Word version, which has all the definitions behind the numbers, and then a graphical version, which is nice. It shows you on the curves. If you're not a member, you can certainly learn more about the dashboard, but there's obviously lots of details you can dig into below that. But this kind of full body scan of the club, I'm always amazed when clubs are $3, $4, $10, $20 million businesses, and in any other industry I've been in, when you spend a few $1,000s to really have good intelligence about the business you're trying to run, it's often something that gets paid back many times over. So clearly, if you're a member, absolutely go in and run these and use them, and contact us if you have any questions about your numbers. We'll help you go through them and interpret them a little bit. So that's what we looked at today. I would just say, in summary, this is all about getting out of the noise of the industry and out of chasing tactical reactive data, like calling up 10 clubs around you and saying, hey, what do you guys charge for dues? Right? Because what any other club charges for dues has nothing to do with what you should be charging for dues or need to generate for dues revenue. So that kind of single point, I got to go answer this question for the board, is really dangerous in the industry. You need to have a complete view of the club, and this dashboard report is a good way to do that. So with that, I'm going to see if we had any questions come in, and Terry, You want to jump in and let me know if we've got any questions here I can quickly answer? And I might have to unmute Terry. Let's try this. You there, Terry?
I can't actually see the questions because the attendees aren't.
Ah, gotcha. Okay, got it. Let me go through very quickly here. Uh, let's see. When you refer to total loaded payroll, does it also include compensation generated by lessons in clinics for professional staff? It does. It does include that, and we do. There are times when we're working with clubs that have a very high lesson revenue, unusually high lesson revenue. We actually look at it both ways because it does impact that ratio. So we'll if you have that, as a club, give us a call because what we do is we look at the ratio with it and without it, because obviously that's a flow through. If not 100% flow through, a 90 or an 85% flow through. And so, yeah, it's good to understand the impact of that. Generally, what it'll do, it'll make your labor ratio look higher than it sort of really is. And so that's a great question and something to think about. Let's see. Can I find the standard expenses most clubs include or allocate towards F&B? For example, does anyone allocate utilities to F&B? Absolutely, they do, and that's one of the reasons for what we do is a standardized model. We do not allocate utilities into the departments. We put it under G&A, and we take all the utilities from all the departments, and we put it all under that one line item that fits under G&A. And now, when you're benchmarking in club benchmarking, every club is doing it exactly the same way. That's why the ad hoc benchmarking the industry doesn't work, because you all will ask each other questions and answer a question, but you're all answering it with different accounting standards, and you're frankly passing back and forth, bad data in often cases. I understand why you've done it in the past. There haven't been many other alternatives, but no, we pull as for example, yeah. So it is. We do a very standardized mapping. It's very USFRC like in its nature, and then every club we get their trial balance and we map their accounts to our metrics the exact same way, so that you don't have that derailing discussion in the boardroom. Like, well, where do they allocate this? Where do they allocate that? When you're showing them data where everybody does it the exact same way, it takes that question completely off the table. But that is a very good question. Thank you. Are these ratios? Or there's a typo there. The club labor as a whole, or just F&B? Okay, so the payroll ratio, the 57% at the median, that's the entire club. That's why I say that one has a direct impact to the bottom line of the club, and it is a club-wide ratio. The F&B ratio, it certainly includes F&B labor, but it is only F&B. It's looking at the net result of F&B relative to the gross profit of the club. I hope that answers that question. When will the recording be available? Usually we have it up within the same day, maybe a day or so. Probably it'll be up by tomorrow morning. With that, I appreciate people hanging on a little bit extra. I was very bad today. I went about 16 minutes over, so I apologize for that. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Certainly feel free to contact me if you've got any further questions, and I'm happy to help you in any way I can, whether you're a member or not. So thank you all, and talk to you soon.